Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. We begin by seeing a spaceship crashing in Malaysia during re-entry into the atmosphere, funded by the Life Foundation. Its cargo contains some unknown life forms called symbiotes. Despite the organization's best efforts, they can only recover 3 of the 4 symbiotes originally on board. At the crash site, one of the astronauts is found alive, unaware that he has been possessed by the missing symbiote. He is rushed into an ambulance, where he brutally attacks the other passengers. The symbiote then changes hosts and sets off into the unknown. In San Francisco, California, reporter Eddie Brock is awakened by his fiancée Anne. While Anne is a successful lawyer, Eddie is a more laid-back reporter. One day, his boss Jack assigns him to interview Carlton Drake, the head of the Life Foundation, something Eddie vehemently protests. Drake is a billionaire who self-identifies as an environmentalist, but Eddie knows better and considers him a criminal. Unfortunately, Eddie's boss leaves him with no choice in the matter, as Drake has the money and resources to get what he wants. Eddie reluctantly agrees. That night, Eddie enjoys a romantic evening with Anne, where he vents about his assignment. Anne's law firm works for Drake, and neither of them likes him. Eddie is concerned that he might cross the line during the interview and be expelled from San Francisco, something that has already happened in New York. He dismisses her concerns, and the two continue to enjoy their date. While Anne is sleeping, Eddie notices a notification on her laptop, piquing his curiosity. He opens the confidential email, which is a wrongful death claim against the Life Foundation. 3 of their test subjects have died, and they want to ensure they are not held responsible. The next day, Eddie attends the interview with Drake, initially trying to impress him with his life achievements. Drake is initially impressed, but Eddie changes course. Instead of discussing the new rocket, he accuses Drake of killing people for his own benefit, highlighting his history of using weaker individuals as subjects for his medical research. These accusations anger Drake, who abruptly ends the interview and kicks Eddie out of the building. Back at the office, Jack reprimands Eddie for his actions at the Life Foundation. Jack, despite recognizing Eddie's talents as a reporter, considers him reckless and careless. He doesn't trust Eddie and fires him. At the same time, Anne is fired from her firm for leaking confidential information, which were the details Eddie saw in Anne's email regarding Drake's wrongful death claim, something that was client-attorney privilege. This is the final straw for Anne, who decides she can no longer tolerate the situation. She returns the engagement ring to Eddie and calls off the wedding. At the Life Foundation, Drake receives his shipment of symbiotes. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, the symbiote that was possessing the paramedic causes a massacre in a crowd before changing hosts again. 6 months later, Drake has been conducting a series of tests with the symbiotes. He has discovered that, to survive on Earth, they need a compatible host. His theory is that if the symbiotes merge with Earth organisms to survive, humans can merge with symbiotes to survive in space. This is despite the protests of scientist Dr. Skirth, who believes that human testing is unethical. In a local bar, Eddie sinks into depression. He has given up his reporter's life and believes he has completely ruined his life. While watching Drake announce his latest project on the news, Eddie is reminded of everything he has lost in pursuit of a big story and leaves the bar alone. On his way home, Eddie stops at a convenience store and generously gives money to a homeless woman named Maria, showing that despite everything, deep down he is still a good person. In the store, he chats with his friend, Mrs. Chen. They exchange jokes about relaxation methods before a man robs her at gunpoint. Since the separation from Anne, Eddie has moved into a rundown apartment with hostile neighbors. He is behind on several bills and, after the incident with Drake, has been blacklisted and struggles to find work. In an attempt to relax, he tries to listen to a therapeutic CD but is disturbed by his neighbor's extremely loud music. Eddie would like to ask the neighbor to lower the volume but is too kind to do so. Instead, he goes to sleep with the loud music in the background. At the Life Foundation, Drake has begun human testing. The first subject is a man named Isaac. Drake comments on his biblical name and claims that while God has abandoned him, he will not abandon him. Drake genuinely believes himself to be a kind of savior of humanity, on the same level as a god, and as such, he toys with the lives of his subjects. He releases the symbiote into Isaac, but it doesn't take long as the symbiote rejects the body, and he quickly kills him. Completely indifferent to Isaac's death, he simply calls the next test subject. In Eddie's routine of going to Mrs. Chen's convenience store, he realizes that Maria is missing and that he is being followed. Aware of his pursuer, Eddie manages to expose the follower as Dr. Skirth. She tries to tell him about the inhuman tests that Dr. Drake has been conducting, but Eddie doesn't want to listen. She begs for his help, but Eddie makes it clear that he has just been the White Knight. His only encounter with Drake cost him his entire life, and he warns her to stay discreet and find someone else to solve her problems. Eddie passes by his old house when he encounters Anne and her new boyfriend Dan, a doctor. The two men share an awkward interaction before Dan enters Anne's house with his own key. Eddie tries to strike up a conversation, but Anne cuts it short, blaming him for everything. Eddie walks the streets of San Francisco before finding himself staring at the Life Institute facility on the Golden Gate Bridge. At that moment, he decides he has nothing left to lose and makes a call to Dr. Skirth. Skirth takes Eddie inside the facility and explains the true purpose of Dr. Drake's rockets. Earth's pollution and overpopulation are leading humanity to its downfall, and Drake believes the future is in the stars. She reveals that during a scouting mission, they found life on a comet, the symbiotes. While a security officer passes by, Skirth distracts him while Eddie goes alone to the laboratory. There, Eddie finds several grotesque and horrifying scenes, such as a symbiote carcass and a dead test subject on the floor, lifeless in one of the test capsules. Eddie finds Maria, who pleads for help. In panic, Eddie triggers an alarm, causing Maria to be sprayed with what is presumed to be liquid nitrogen. Eddie breaks the glass to free her, but she jumps on him, transferring the symbiote to Eddie before falling dead. Eddie is forced to leave her behind and flee to the exit. He realizes he has gained a significant amount of strength and easily takes down the guards, even tearing down the door in front of him, then exits the facility. The guards pursue him into the forest, and with the help of his new powers, he escapes by climbing a tree undetected. In Eddie's apartment, he becomes ravenous and eats everything in sight. He even resorts to eating from the trash before vomiting everything into the toilet. In the lab, Drake is furious that one of the symbiotes is missing, unaware that Skirth let the intruder in. He sends his men to find the intruder. The night, however, was not a complete disaster. One of the test subjects managed to stabilize and merge with his symbiote. In Eddie's apartment, he regains consciousness and reflects on the wild night he has just had. Elsewhere, the missing symbiote, which has been jumping from host to host, finds itself in California and chooses a young girl as its next host. Eddie, still shaken by the events at the lab, is concerned for Skirth's safety. He tries to make a call to spread the news, but is disturbed by a second voice in his head telling him to eat. Eddie eventually encounters Anne and Dan at a restaurant to tell them about his discoveries, but the symbiote's insatiable hunger takes over and he causes a scene in the restaurant. He attempts to eat a steak, but the voice desires raw meat. He settles for live lobsters in the tank to salvage the situation. Dan apologizes for Eddie's behavior and takes him on as his patient. After the restaurant events, Dan takes Eddie for examination, but when he is scanned for an MRI, the symbiote goes haywire, forcing the test to end. Dan dismisses it as a case of claustrophobia and sends Eddie home. In the lab, Skirth is identified as the leak. To make matters worse, the test subject who merged with the symbiote is slowly dying despite Drake's best efforts. When Eddie arrives home, he is called by Anne and Dan. They tell him that he has a virus, which would explain the abnormalities he has been experiencing. Dan suggests that the voices he's hearing are hallucinations as well. It is Dan's belief that some antibiotics will fix everything and make Eddie return to normal. After hanging up, the neighbor plays loud music once again. This time, however, Eddie is agitated and brave enough to approach him and tell him to lower the volume. While the neighbor initially ignores Eddie, he quickly obeys after the symbiote reveals its terrifying face. In the lab, Drake confronts Skirth about her betrayal. He lies to her and says she can trust him. Feeling worried, she reveals that it was Eddie whom she brought to the lab. With all the information he wanted, Drake thanks her and releases a symbiote to end her. In Eddie's apartment, Drake's security guards come after him, but the symbiote takes control against Eddie's will. Several armed men come after him, and one by one, Eddie, apologizing, knocks them out. The symbiote suggests they eat them all, but instead, the two escape through the window. When Drake receives the news, he is stunned to learn that Eddie has achieved symbiosis and is even more motivated to capture him. In an alley, Eddie believes he is hallucinating everything, but at that moment, Drake's men find him. A chase ensues, and Eddie, with the help of the symbiote, performs impossible maneuvers on his motorcycle. The symbiote takes full control and saves Eddie multiple times before the pursuit ends with Eddie being blinded and thrown from the motorcycle. With Eddie injured from the crash, Drake and his men are sure they've got him, until the symbiote begins to dominate Eddie's body. Now completely immersed in the alien, Eddie heals completely and rises as a monster among men. It's only thanks to the efforts of the police that Eddie doesn't consume Drake's men. Together, as symbiote and host, Eddie escapes to safety. Amazed by what just happened, Eddie observes his healed limbs and begins to converse with his parasite. He introduces himself as Venom and explains that he and Eddie are now one. Everything Eddie knows, he knows too, and with Eddie's cooperation, they can take down Drake together. Meanwhile, the missing symbiote has arrived in San Francisco as a young girl. And inside the car receives a call from Dan, where he tells her that the results of Eddie's MRI are much worse than they originally expected. He wants Eddie in the hospital as soon as possible. At the Life Foundation, Skirtha's lifeless body is on the floor, unable to properly merge. The symbiote dies with her. With the loss of another sample, Venom becomes the last known symbiote. In the wake of Eddie's citywide chase, the police are on high alert and still can't catch up with him. Eddie and Venom try to enter his former office to deliver the evidence against Drake, but they are denied access from the front, so instead, Venom takes control and scales the building for him. They almost fall to their deaths when a plane passes overhead, interrupting Venom, but they manage to survive. Eddie leaves the evidence on his former employer's desk and decides to take the elevator down. On the way out, Eddie is greeted by dozens of armed men with rifles and smoke grenades. He tries to warn them not to fight, but they choose to engage anyway. The smoke grenades only lead to their downfall, as Venom uses them as cover to systematically defeat them one by one. For a moment, the men seem to be gaining the upper hand with light grenades, but things quickly shift in Eddie's favor, and he manages to come out on top. And arrives and witnesses the massacre. Eddie manages to regain control, and after explaining that he's scared, and convinces him to go to the hospital with her. On the way to the hospital, Venom talks to and through Eddie and explains that he is particularly sensitive to sound and fire. At the Life Foundation, the girl hosting the missing symbiote confronts Drake. Initially confused, Drake approaches her before being possessed by it. In the hospital, Dan tells Eddie that Venom is killing him from the inside. And Dan pressures Venom to leave Eddie alone, and it's only after it turns on the MRI machine that Venom leaves Eddie's body, finally separating them. Eddie leaves in anger, feeling betrayed by Venom. In the middle of a conversation between Dan and Ann, Venom escapes through a ventilation duct. Crawling through the duct, Venom takes possession of a dog to survive. Meanwhile, Eddie is captured by Drake's men and taken to the company. Drake confronts Eddie and shows that he has successfully merged with the missing symbiote, named Riot, and the two have made an agreement to lead humans and symbiotes together. Without Venom, Eddie is of no use to Drake. He orders his men to take Eddie to be killed. Drake's men take Eddie to the forest to dispose of him, but before they can finish the job, Venom and Ann arrive to save him. Venom has joined with Ann to save Eddie, and together they consume the head of Drake's chief security officer. Venom in Ann's body kisses Eddie, and through the kiss, Venom merges with Eddie once again. Venom explains that Riot is a team leader of the symbiote group and that he is very strong. They must stop him before the rocket launch, or he will bring the rest of his species back to Earth. At the Life Foundation, the spacecraft is being prepared for launch. Drake intends to fly it himself. When Eddie asks Venom why he is helping, Venom explains that, among his species, he is a loser like Eddie. He wants to stay because together on Earth, they can be something more. Against the wishes of his scientists, Drake initiates the launch and kills everyone present there. Venom notes that Riot is one of the strongest symbiotes and that they are unlikely to defeat him, but they will fight anyway. Venom courageously steps in front of Riot, but seeing the weapons his enemy can create, he gets nervous. Riot and Venom destroy everything in their path as they fight. The two tear each other apart, and Riot attacks Eddie and rips Venom from him. Before Venom is destroyed, Eddie manages to merge with him again, leading to a fierce symbiote battle. However, Riot manages to absorb both of them, becoming even more terrifying and powerful. It's only thanks to and on the speaker system that the four beings separate. Eddie and Drake engage in hand-to-hand combat, and Eddie seemingly wins, but he is impaled in the back by Riot. Fortunately, Venom merges with him to save him in time. Venom climbs onto the rocket, sabotaging it with Riot's own weapon, causing the rocket to explode and finally kill Riot. Eddie freefalls into the bay, and Venom seemingly sacrifices himself to protect Eddie from the explosion and save him. Sometime later, Eddie and Ann talk in front of Van's house. Ann has returned to work as a lawyer, and Eddie as a reporter. Ann tells Eddie that Dan can't know about their kiss, to which Venom responds in Eddie's head that he and Eddie will win her back. He survived the rocket explosion and now they are working together again, but in secret, under the condition that Venom only hurts bad people. One night, Eddie sees the thug who often intimidated Mrs. Chen, so he reacts, and Venom takes charge to devour him, indicating that Eddie and Venom are really getting along. A silent nod, and we are introduced to a story that begins in an old reform school for youth in California, in 1996, where we meet Cletus, a serial killer imprisoned with his girlfriend named Frances, who has superpowers. When he asks her what the doctor said, she responds that the mutations and powers are advancing. So she fears they will take her to another place where there are others like her. And she was right to fear because at that exact moment, although Cletus becomes furious, some guards take Frances away. On the way, she attacks the guards with her ability to manipulate sound, but one guard manages to shoot her. After that, she appears in the hospital and is welcomed into her new home. Back in the present, Frances lives locked in a mental institution for insane criminals called Ravencroft, and there's some doctors enter to feed her with precautions so that she does not attack them with her superpower. It seems that every day they give her the newspaper where she follows the news of her boyfriend Cletus, who is imprisoned, and it is still unknown whether he will be sentenced to death or not. Meanwhile, our protagonist Eddie Brock still works as a journalist, and we find out that Cletus wants to talk to him. As this can help them find out where the rest of the bodies are buried, the detective recommends that he go. Although at first Venom wants to eat the detective, Eddie manages to control him in the bathroom and then ends up saying that he will go. Later, Eddie visits him at San Quentin prison, where Cletus says that all he wants is to send a message to his fans, and in return, he will give him his life story because it will reveal all his secrets, and with that, his journalism career will be back on top. So, Eddie accepts, and Cletus tells him the phrase he wants on the front page, "That distant cathedral is all I see, fractured angel, the other part of me." Even though Eddie doesn't understand anything about this phrase, he manages to put it on the front page of the newspaper, and that's how his girlfriend Frances reads it. Before leaving, Venom tells Eddie to look at Cletus' drawings on the wall. Eddie doesn't understand and ends up leaving while Cletus tells him not to forget about him. Back at home, Venom starts copying all of Cletus' drawings. There he draws some things that Eddie doesn't understand, but Venom tells him to pay attention, and after researching some things on the internet, they realize that one of the drawings is where the missing bodies were buried. So, the police will find a bunch of bodies and start interviewing Eddie because he's the only person Cletus talks to. The detective gets annoyed because the investigation was done by a journalist and not the police, and they also confirm the death penalty for Cletus, which leaves the couple quite upset. At night, Venom tells him that they should go out and catch criminals for him to eat. He also says that he wants to be free and stuff, besides being hungry and not wanting to eat the chickens because they've become his friends. At one point, the relationship seems like it won't last, and they go looking for food, but Mrs. Chen no longer has chocolates. So, even though Venom wants to eat human brains, Eddie takes him to eat chickens. Moments later, they see a thief, and Venom goes to eat him, but Eddie doesn't let him and ends up throwing him in the trash. After that, his ex-girlfriend Ann calls him, and since Venom misses her, Eddie answers. She tells him that she needed some time after everything that happened. Finally, he asks if they can meet to talk. On the following night, he goes to a restaurant, but the conversation gets a bit strange. There, they talk about things that no one is interested in, and at one point, she tells him that she wanted to meet and talk because she is about to get married. Apparently, she is going to marry her new boyfriend Dan, and although Eddie tells her that he's happy for her, Venom is sadder than ever. After that, she finds him strange and asks if Venom is still inside him, but he says no, claiming that he died a while ago in the fight against Riot. However, after talking for a while and telling her that he's not ready for commitments, she seems to realize that Venom is still inside her ex-boyfriend. Then, she tells Venom to take care of Eddie, and after that, they leave very sadly. Afterward, they ride a motorcycle for a while. Venom tells Eddie not to worry and that he will help him get through this and relax a bit. Venom does what he does best, cooks for Eddie. At one point, he picks up the mail and receives a letter from Cletus. There, he tells him that he invites him to witness his execution and his last moments on Earth. He also tells him that he is responsible for causing Cletus end and that they will stop his heart as when he was born. But if he hadn't been revived at that time, he would never have killed his grandmother, his mother, and his dog, and then he would never have been beaten by his father and sent to the reform school where he met his girlfriend. So, the next day, Eddie and Venom go to the prison to visit Cletus. Eddie records the interview, and Cletus talks to him about the consequences of the things we do. He also tells them that the two of them are alike and that they are both family. Eddie asks Cletus if he wants anything before he dies, but the villain wishes for Eddie to live alone for the rest of his life, just like him. There, he starts saying things to make Venom angry until he finally manages to make the symbiote attack him, and Cletus bites him. There, he realizes that Eddie has something inside him that is not blood. After that, Eddie and Venom fight. Venom tells him that everything he has achieved is thanks to him, but there they end up fighting, and Venom wants to kick him out of the house by throwing all his things. In the end, Venom ends up leaving, enters the body of another man who is on the street, and finally Eddie is free, but he starts hearing noises and sees that Venom has destroyed his motorcycle. Eventually, Venom also moves into the body of a woman riding a bicycle. The next day is Cletus' death sentence. He says his last words, and finally, he is injected with the lethal dose, but something strange begins to happen. Something starts coming out of his body, and soon a massacre begins there. A new symbiote called Carnage emerges and kills everyone in front of him, showing off his power. After that, Cletus finally escapes with his new symbiote. The next day, Eddie is already enjoying his life without Venom. He starts cleaning his apartment, frees the chickens, and in the meantime, Venom walks quietly through the city. At night, Eddie sees on TV that the serial killer Cletus escaped, and then the detective appears and starts doubting Eddie, but he says he doesn't know anything, and in the end, the detective doesn't tell him anything and leaves. After that, Eddie starts listening to the recording of the last time he saw Cletus but doesn't understand anything. Meanwhile, Venom continues looking for a compatible body, so along the way, this guy also dies. He then moves into the body of another man who happened to be at a costume party, so Venom goes unnoticed, and everyone loves the costume. Meanwhile, Cletus and Carnage kill another person. After that, Cletus steals a car, starts talking to his symbiote, and since Carnage wants to kill Venom and Cletus wants to find his girlfriend, they decide to help each other. On the way, for no apparent reason, they throw a van off a bridge, so I guess they killed at least one person there. At the same time, Eddie continues investigating and goes to the old reform school. There, he finds the initials FB carved into a tree, so he calls the detective and asks if he knows a woman with those initials. Soon the detective tells him her name but also mentions that he was the one who killed her many years ago, although he doesn't even know she's still alive. Later, Cletus kills another guy, surfs the web, and discovers that Frances is alive. Meanwhile, she is still locked in her cell, while the doctor tells her that her boyfriend has escaped but will never be able to find her in that place. Suddenly, Cletus appears inside Frances' cell, kills the doctor, and then destroys the cell to finally embrace his love. As they escape, they kill the guards who appear. After that, they drive away in the car until, at a certain point, Carnage starts attacking the police officers and easily kills them. However, he discovers that he is sensitive to sound when Frances uses her power. So, he angrily tells Frances not to do it anymore. Afterward, Venom arrives at the store almost dying, asking Mrs. Chen for chocolate. It doesn't take long, and the man who is not compatible dies. At the police station, the detective asks Eddie why strange things always happen around him, saying that the rest of the patients at the hospital said they saw a monster. Then Eddie remembers that Cletus bit his hand days before he died and begins to understand everything. So, he calls his lawyer, and when she arrives, he tells her that the serial killer Cletus also has an alien inside him, and now they need to find Venom. After that, and goes looking for the symbiote in the Chinese market and realizes that Venom is inside Mrs. Chen. She tells her about the problem and ends up convincing her to find Eddie. Meanwhile, Cletus sets fire to the reform school, and now they are going to look for the detective who took Frances' eye. And returns to the police station, and with Venom, she takes him out of there. On the way, Venom and Eddie reconcile, becoming friends again. The detective crosses paths with Cletus, then tries to arrest him, but Carnage appears and dominates the detective to take him to Frances. Meanwhile, she enters Eddie's apartment, finds an engagement ring, and sees In's photo, realizing their love. She goes to look for her and finds her, then knocks her out. She then incapacitates Dan and tells him that Cletus wants to swap Eddie's head for Anne's, and then she leaves. After that, Dan calls Eddie, tells him that they have kidnapped Anne, and they are heading to the wedding. It turns out that it's Cletus and Francis' wedding, and they have kidnapped a priest to perform the ceremony. At one point, Eddie shows up with Venom, and it seems like they are going to start fighting, but Venom, upon seeing his enemy, gets a little scared because Carnage is very powerful and says that the couple should be happy. Anyway, in the end, Eddie convinces Venom, and what we all expected begins, a battle of symbiote creatures, extremely powerful and destructive monsters. Meanwhile, Francis goes to kill the detective, but Carnage interrupts her to tell her not to scream. After that, he takes the opportunity to eat the priest for no apparent reason. The detective escapes, but Francis goes after him and leaves him for dead. As the battle continues, in the midst of the fight, we learn that Cletus hates Eddie because as a journalist, he never explained the reason for his evilness or talked about when he was a boy and was abused by his family. Anyway, that doesn't matter much. What matters is the final battle between monsters. After Venom throws Francis from the top of the church, she screams, and her power causes destruction, with everyone starting to fall. She is crushed to death by the debris, and when the dust settles, we see the symbiote Carnage trying to return to Cletus, but Venom appears and grabs him, then devours him, finally putting an end to him. After killing Carnage, Cletus End arrives. Before dying, he says that all he wanted was Eddie's friendship. After this statement, Venom kills him. Moments later, and leaves with her boyfriend, and the police arrive at the scene, and apparently, the detective is still alive. Finally, Eddie and Venom are still friends and go on vacation to a beach, as Venom had asked, and both are happy on the beach. Sometime later, we see Eddie watching TV. There, Venom says that everyone has a hidden past, and he has billions of light years of knowledge. The point is, there he gives him a sample of the things the symbiotes experience traveling through the universe. But right at that moment, something strange happens, and they are sent somewhere else. Venom says he didn't do anything, and apparently, all of this was because of what Doctor Strange did, and now they are in the universe of Spider-Man.